Now, late last week, the European Union passed new rules to regulate tech's hottest sector in 2023. Of course, we're talking about artificial intelligence systems. Now, essentially what was agreed to on Friday is a milestone law that regulators in the EU hope can set a template, if you will, for other countries in the world. The law imposes transparency requirements for general-purpose large language models like ChatGPT. But systems with what the EU describes as having systemic impacts will be subject to a much higher level of disclosure. Now, the Act also bans the use of biometric systems that can identify people by traits like their race, their sexual orientation, their skin color, and so on and so forth. It also bans the indiscriminate scraping of faces off the internet in order to train large language models. Companies that do not comply with these rules can face some pretty hefty fines, up to 7% of their global turnover. Now, the bans on specific kinds of AI systems, that takes effect in 6 months. So effectively, you're looking at H2 2024. But then that will progressively lead up to the full implementation of these rules in about 2 years' time. Hours ago, I spoke to Nanjira Sambuli. She's a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I started our conversation by asking her if we might see similar rules on AI coming up in Africa in the same way that data protection laws followed a template set by the EU's General Data Protection Regulations.
You wouldn't be wrong. And I think what we have seen now called the Brussels effect is likely to take place as well with artificial intelligence, with the passing of this AI Act. Just because on one hand, if at all, there will be any companies or startups here that are serving the European market, we expect, as happened with GDPR, they'll be required to comply. So that normative effect that the European regulations have, not just in Africa, but in the rest of the world, are likely to translate to this nascent field.
So that conversation around biometrics, that refers to things, like facial recognition systems, for example, because we've seen examples where AI systems in the past have essentially, for lack of a better word, imported the bias of their coders and their users and decided, yeah, well, we're going to score people of this particular race differently from persons of this other race.
Absolutely. And I think that sends a signal or a wave around this sort of rush to collect any data to train models, that there will be limited use in how those affect decision making or how companies sell those solutions to other companies or to governments. So I think this is a really foundational aspect because a lot of that data is up for grabs around the world. And now with such a statement that, such will not be used to sort of rank people or, make value judgments is a critical introduction into the AI regulatory space around the world.
But does it extend, and again, I'm using the GDPR example we started with, to the extent that you'd say GDPR essentially applies to EU citizens. If these systems essentially are saying, look, you can't essentially apply biometric judgments in your large language models or whatever AI systems you're wanting to use here, does that then provide, by extension, some measure of protection from the ordinary internet user in African markets?
Maybe. I mean, I think there's a bit of a weird positive arc to that, because how do you discriminate except by race, perhaps, who's a European citizen and who isn't? It might have that catalytic effect such that whoever is trying to use that data has to prove at the very least that they've not trained their models using European citizens' data. Now, proving who's a European citizen and how their data was collected and where becomes very tricky in a transjurisdictional nature of digital systems. So in a sense, time will tell us whether this will have that sort of like worldwide effect, or we'll start seeing sort of like categorization by geographies and sort of data walls coming up insofar as which ones are allowed to train these models, just because, say, Africa hasn't regulated in that regard, versus trying to lock out European data sets from these models that will be training AI systems.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see exactly how this applies to, companies that tend to outsource, a lot of that initial data collection, data sorting business, to countries like ours, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and so on.
Precisely. Interesting times ahead in that regard.
Indeed. So one of the other things...
I think what it does...
please go ahead.
One of the things it does there is around compliance, right? Because it has that compliance mechanism. So whether you're a startup here in Kenya or Nigeria, serving or trying to serve systems that, serve Europeans, there's that compliance burden that will come with that will require you to operate on a higher standard. So the question will become, do you have compliance mechanisms that are separate for Europeans because of this act, or do you actually apply them across the board as a bare minimum threshold?
I want to build on that line of argument, that line of thought that you've actually brought up. This, that this law might essentially create essentially a sort of two-tier playing field. And I'll read something for you from Amnesty in response to the passing of the act. Quote, lawmakers failed to ban the export of harmful AI technologies, including for social scoring, which would be legal in the EU. So allowing European companies to profit off the tech that the law recognizes impermissibly harms human rights in their home states establishes a dangerous double standard.
Yeah, expected. And this ties to bigger issues that we've seen around where surveillance tech generally is created versus where it's exported to. And we now squarely enter the world of governing technologies and how rights frameworks sort of limit what kinds of technologies are not only developed, but deployed. You could easily end up in a situation where, yes, a European startup, hypothetically, does not, use those systems in Europe, but then exports surveillance heavy or biometric scraping heavy tool to Africa or other parts of the world because these rules don't apply. So there's a real risk that could happen, and it could create what we can easily now call an AI divide. So a lot of this will also come down to how do we actually make sure that European regulation sets a baseline that at least helps us move further up rather than going to a race to the bottom where some people are left as free terrain to sort of train data or train AI systems wantonly while they get some protections. These are going to be very hard questions to ask down the line.